So this month's program is being presented by Dr. Wood Olson, a research ecologist for the USDA Forest Service. And I will now turn the program over to Dr. Olson.
Thank you, Ralph. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm with the U.S. Forest Service. My duty station is in Corvallis, Oregon. I've been working on riparian buffers and their effects since 1993 during the development of the Northwest Forest Plan for federal lands in the moist coniferous forests of the Northwest. I was asked to join a study design crew to develop a study that included riparian buffers as well as thinning. So that, you know, up to now, I still am working on that study, 23 years on the before, during, and after buffer implementation. So over that time frame, I've learned a lot about headwaters and riparian buffers, and I've pulled that together in a presentation for you all today. Now, I know your backgrounds are quite varied, and so I will give some background on riparian buffers and the context of why they're important at the beginning of this slideshow. And then we'll go into some lessons learned over the years, both from retrospective studies, where people have looked at what has happened during past forest management implementation, and also some experimental studies where looking at riparian buffers in particular with before, after, and controlled studies. Then as we wrap up, I'll talk about, well, what are the different types of riparian buffer recommendations that have been coming out from these various bodies of work, and then where do we go from here? So let's see if my cursor works. Hopefully you'll see a little highlighter pen, and I'm just going to show on this upper left photograph that here we have a clear cut with a headwater stream. You can see the water flowing down it over on the side. The center photo, you can see the stream a little bit better because it is buffered in a clear cut. And then this lower right is from the study that I have been implementing. It's the riparian buffer study with upland thinning, and so you can see that there are trees in the upland as well as some leaf islands, some clear-cut gaps, but the riparian buffers are quite evident as they extend into that upland, as well as there's a diagonal stream that goes across this entire unit. This is a BLM checkerboard square, and it happened to have a stream right across the diagonal. So I'm trying to get this to go. Next slide. Let's see. Okay, here we go. I figured out how to do the slides. So there are numerous considerations for headwater riparian buffer management, and this hexagonal slide is capturing the ones that I'm going to be talking about today. This is not an exhaustive list of things that come under consideration when riparian buffers are being implemented, but these are some of the main considerations and the ones that have been examined in a variety of studies that I'll be covering. So in the center hexagon, you can see, you know, it's just what are the considerations for headwater riparian buffers. Some of the dominant considerations are the species that occur in the streams or in the riparian zone, and their habitats, the stream habitats or the riparian zone habitats. Some of the key factors for stream habitats include downwood, stream temperature, and then you go a little bit further and there are various processes that come into play: bank stability, sedimentation, landslide potential, and then at the other corner, other processes, climate change, fire mitigation. We'll go through a bunch of these today. Often we start with our focus on species and their habitats, and so why is that? Among forest ecosystem services, species and water are the most treasured aquatic natural resources. So over this time frame that I've been involved with riparian buffers, from 1993 to present, the concept of ecosystem services has entered our literature, entered our management, and they're quite varied. Ecosystem service is a terminology that speaks about the benefits of natural resources for people. And so here you see a photo collage of many things that people value in the forests. But when you get into the aquatic and riparian habitats, the key benefits often come down to some of the species and the habitats, and water is a key part of that. For the species, the ones that top the list of species of concern are those that are endemic species, native species, and those endemic to a region. Endemic species are becoming more and more of a concern as time goes on, and some people believe that we are in a 6th major mass extinction event for the entire Earth. And if you look through the literature, it's becoming quite clear that the most imperiled species across all taxa on Earth are related to fresh water, aquatic biodiversity, and their ecosystems. And it's likely because in these systems there's very high endemism and cryptic species. So there's a lot of species that are unique to very small areas. They often have some dispersal limitations, and we're learning a lot about our aquatic biodiversity right now as well. The species are not totally described. At the bottom of the slide, you can see some numbers of the types of different taxonomic groups and the perception of how vulnerable they are to losses right now, with turtles, freshwater turtles being the most vulnerable to losses, followed by freshwater fish, then amphibians, which also are tied to freshwater, and then the bottom of the list there, mammals and birds. Now, for all the taxonomic groups on Earth, these numbers have not been compiled, so we don't have a comparable number, for example, for fungi or invertebrates, but these are common numbers that you might have read about. But in the top 3 really are dealing with the freshwater ecosystems that I'm covering today. Here's some more numbers just for the western forests, looking at wildlife associations with riparian areas. Generally in Oregon and Washington, over half the wildlife have association with riparian areas. 75% of vertebrates are riparian associates in the Oregon Blue Mountains. So once you get over to the drier area of our region, you get more association with these cool, moist zones, the streamside riparian areas. 79% of vertebrates are riparian associates in the Oregon Great Basin area. On the west side, 36% of west side old growth associated vertebrates have ties to riparian habitats. So these are, you know, some numbers that have been thrown out there by various authors that have done synthesis type studies. In addition, in California, 40% of the reptiles are riparian associates, especially turtles, for example. And in the Northwest, 87% of amphibian species occur in forest riparian areas. 32% of Northwest amphibians are obligate riparian species. That means they don't occur anywhere else. They have some part of their life history that they have to be in a riparian area. 53% of old growth associated amphibians are tied to riparian, and a quarter, 25% of Northwest amphibians are tied to headwaters. So these are, you know, some fun facts, but this will give you some relevance, some bearing for why I'll be talking about things like amphibians today. It's because they have a very strong tie to these west side riparian areas. Some interesting things about aquatic species, why they're so vulnerable is there are a lot of these species out on the landscape. We have a lot of endemism in aquatic fauna, and so these maps here are showing endemic species, those that occur. You can see the the range maps of 4 species of giant salamanders in the Northwest, 2 species of tailed frogs, 4 species of torrent salamanders, and 2 salamanders that are commonly known as seep-dwelling, the Van Dyke salamander and the Coeur d'Alene salamander. So they have fairly restricted distributions. Other terrestrial amphibians that have benefits, or some of their habitats are in riparian zones, are listed here. These are more of the plethodonid salamanders, but again, if you look at their maps, they have very restricted distributions. So if you were to go anywhere in the moist coniferous forests of the west side, you would get a different species complex depending on where you landed. And that is because these species distributions are very restricted, and you'll just get a different complement in different places. Fish are the same way. So here's an example watershed from the Oregon Cascade Range, and you can see some of the dominant habitats by various fish in this watershed. The blue are headwaters, so we're going to be talking mostly about headwater streams today. And so many of those blue streams are outside of fish distribution. That's why you hear of fish-bearing streams and non-fish-bearing streams, especially relative to riparian buffers. The downstream sections throughout the Northwest are fish-bearing streams, not only for the salmonid fishes, but for others like sculpins as well. So some of the concepts I've just shown you is that aquatic ecosystems are multi-state. The aquatic riparian species will differ by location, either at a large scale across the map or even among reaches or small scale, fine scale areas within a watershed. The habitats also differ by locations. Let me just explain this graphic a little bit before I move on. So this is a schematic diagram of an ecosystem, and here the upper figure shows the domain of an ecosystem, with the little circles being the components of the ecosystem. So that you might think of the components as the variety of habitats that can occur in the system. So here we're talking about aquatic ecosystems. The various dots could show you the distribution of different habitat types. Or you can think of these also as the aquatic communities and the different community assemblages, the different types of species that occur in different places. So we expect that the ecosystem is not entirely stable. It jiggers around, and that's what's shown in figure B here, that over time there may be some changes, some disturbances, and you have a constant dynamic going on of habitat conditions varying through time and through space. So this is what the reference condition is for aquatic systems. It varies over the landscape, and it can be shown in a static fashion here, but we understand that things do change. We have natural disturbances and natural variation going on over time. So going on, in headwaters in the Northwest, up to 80% of a stream network length can be these headwater streams, and this figure on the left shows the Oregon Coast Range and a watershed that drains right into the Pacific Ocean. So the headwaters are all these crenulations along the side slopes, and you can see those up and down this landscape. This happens to be, I think, near Cummins Creek, so it's a wilderness area with old growth. And the streams are small in these areas. Oftentimes they're very high gradient as well. So back to this picture, again, 80% of these little blue, if you were to count up the miles of stream here of the blue, they greatly outnumber the miles of the bigger streams down slope. And they change over time, and some of the natural disturbances that we know of include landslides, and there have been several models of landslide potential. And even recently, you know, as we've been getting a lot of rain, one of the things that you may be hearing is that, oh, there's a road got covered because there was a landslide. But there's natural landslides that occur, and that has been modeled. It's a function of the steep slopes and the type of substrate, the geology of that area. Oftentimes, landslide-prone areas are in headwaters, and so here you see landslide-prone areas along these tiny little streams. So that's a disturbance that can be specific to these headwaters. Another example of a disturbance, a natural disturbance, is when we have weather variation, climate variation. And later on in the show today, I'll talk about some data that we have that when you have wet years, you have your headwater streams flowing, but as you have drier years, then some of those headwater streams start drying up. You may get a spatially intermittent pattern, as shown by this one here, C, or you may just have some of the topmost parts of that headwater going dry, and that might be a seasonal variation in the warm, dry summer, for example. So that is a type of natural variation, a natural type of disturbance for these headwaters. So back to this figure, not only do we see that these aquatic systems are multi-state because you have different species in different places, but you may have species differing over time in different places because of these disturbance regimes. If you have a landslide or if you have a drought event, you may have some losses of species in particular areas over time. And so the habitats may change. And there's a growing concern that the frequency and magnitude of disturbances in aquatic systems are changing, and probably induced by some human disturbances like timber harvest. And this is affecting the resiliency of aquatic ecosystems, potentially taking them from a historic domain that has some variation over what we're calling a conceptual tipping point to a new domain, which this new domain would jigger around quite a bit, but it has a different subset of components here. It may have a new component. Here's a dark black dot, for example, that might have something that was not apparent previously, or it may just have a different subset of conditions or species. And so these tipping points are conceptual, and we're worried that our aquatic ecosystems are vulnerable to change, especially as we see a variety of species that are aquatic dependent being quite vulnerable to losses. We may be going over a tipping point, and it's possible, but we're not quite sure if we can go back to the original. And there may be multiple different new domains possible, and so that's sort of conceptually where we are ecologically with these aquatic systems. So that gets us back to what are some of the considerations for riparian buffer management, because as we start to characterize each of these considerations, some of them are changing and could contribute to that ecological resilience of the system, or maybe push it over into a new domain. So climate change, for example, might be one of those factors that pushes us into a new domain, perhaps wildfire, increasing landslide potential, or if we have increasing erosion. So some of these things are of concern, and we think that we could mitigate for them with riparian buffers. So as we look at the landscape and we look at stream reaches, how are these various considerations addressed by riparian buffer strategies? So there are several questions that are being asked in the various science studies. And so this is a landscape from the Oregon Cascade Range, and I've just circled some stream buffers so you can see that we have a variety of things going on out there. We have little noodles, spaghetti noodles of buffers, little tiny ones and bigger ones, blocks of land that actually these are areas being highly managed. Here's another area being highly managed. And if you look closely even here, you can see some ribbons of buffers as they go through the landscape. So, so there's a lot of questions about riparian buffers. How effective are they? Are there effective ways to manage for those considerations that I've shown previously, whether they be species or habitat components, or processes and disturbances as well? So some of the key considerations vary by the lens that you look through. So if you were focusing on fish and fish habitat, there are a smaller subset of things that really float to the top as your considerations of things that are important that you might want to manage by riparian buffers. Intrinsic potential gets to the potential of the landscape to provide for fish habitat. Stream temperature, many of our fish in the Northwest are cool, adapted species, and so thermal loading and stream temperature are key considerations for salmonids. Downwood provides habitat variation. A piece of downwood in a stream, whether it be a root wad or a log, can create pool habitat. And the differential between pool, which is slow-moving water, and fast-moving water in a riffle or a cascade, differentiates the stream, and various species are associated with slow or fast water. Debris flow potential, this is the landslides. We can buffer streams and retain rooting strength of trees and affect their potential for debris flow or for landslides. Similarly, providing trees along streams provides bank stability through their rooting strength and can be a way to control erosion. Looking at the substrate distribution along streams is also important. There are ties to the various life history strategies, or not strategies, life history stages, I meant, and species with substrate as well. And then fire regime is another thing that is being tied to fish habitat distributions. But if your lens is different, let's say, before I go to a different lens, here I've grayed out some of the things that were not on that list. So these riparian considerations were not so much on that list I just gave you. Okay, so now we change our lens to, well, what's important for amphibians? Well, amphibians, we've come to learn, many amphibians have their distribution not only in the perennial downstream reaches, but in the headwaters. And so headwater conditions become a key factor for amphibians, and not just in the water, but the riparian zone. And many of those amphibians need to go up and over ridgelines for connectivity, so the overland connectivity becomes important. The riparian system on its own is another set of considerations, and so if you are retaining a riparian buffer strip, it could be comprised of those young trees from an old clear cut. Our riparian buffer zones have not always been out there. They've only been out there for the last 20, 30 years or so. So you might have a highly stocked riparian zone, and you may have some concern to accelerate tree growth in your riparian area. Or it may be a legacy of a past clear cut and plantation, and there may be a reduced number of minority tree species there if it was managed to promote Douglas fir. Perhaps promoting structural heterogeneity is a management goal for riparian areas. Riparian areas, I've mentioned some of these numbers before, but there's over 100 late successional and old growth species of concern that have been identified that are associated with riparian areas. So LSOG, concerned species, in addition to another 800 concerned species, at least on lists that the federal agencies have. Sometimes people get surprised at the number of species associated with the riparian areas, and so when the Northwest Forest Plan was developing, there were many expert panels put together for various reasons, and this list of over 100 species on this slide and the next one are those that really benefited from the Northwest Forest Plan buffers. And so the various taxonomic groups looked at what species of concern they had. So these are not just all species. These are the species of concern that had associations with the FEMAT buffers, if you know that acronym, the Northwest Forest Plan buffers. There's bryophytes, fungi, lichens, and vascular plants. On the next slide, mollusks, amphibians, fish, birds, bats, other mammals. So the list is not overwhelming, but it's still over 100. And again, these are just the species of concern. So I'm going to talk in the when we get to some lessons learned today about some of the amphibians that occur here. And Anietes flavapunctatus is in the southern part of the region, the black salamander. It barely gets into Oregon. There are several species of torrent salamander, and they're Rhyocatryton genus, the Cascades torrent salamander, the Columbia torrent salamander, and the southern torrent salamander. The fourth species is up in the Olympic Peninsula. It was not considered a species of concern because of all the reserved lands in the Olympic Peninsula. So I just wanted to emphasize that this list are the concerned species, not all species. Cope's giant was a concerned species, but the coastal giant salamander was not. The Van Dyke salamander was a concerned species, but the Dunn salamander was not, another species very much like the Van Dyke salamander. The tailed frog was a concerned species, but this is only the Northwest Forest Plan area, so the tailed frog that occurs in eastern Oregon, eastern Washington was not included on this list. I mentioned that there were 800 species of concern for the federal agencies in this area, and so that's including early cereal species, not just the old growth associated ones. So this is a much longer list that is highly managed now by the federal agencies in Oregon and Washington. And so this is mentioned in an upcoming book. I just wanted to mention that we're putting together, myself and B. Van Horn are putting together a book on forestry in our region, lessons learned in the moist coniferous forests. And this book is about not just aquatics that I'm talking about today, but it's everything. So look for that next fall or winter. We're just getting it ready for Island Press right now. Okay, so I'm segueing now into the lessons learned. And I'm going to go through this pretty fast. 4 lessons or 4 studies that are retrospective studies, so they looked at things that happened in the past. And then I have 4 experimental studies, and I'll go into a little bit more depth in the part that I've been participating in. So back in 1989, one of the first studies on the effects of timber harvest on streams and the denizens of the streams was by Steve Korn and Bruce Burry, and they looked along the Oregon coast and looked at cut-over streams and uncut streams. And the important part here is that over half of their cut-over streams really had much reduction of their amphibian biodiversity. Many had 0 amphibians left or just 1 species. And that was in comparison to the uncut streams that had 3 to 4 amphibians throughout. And I've talked just last week to Bruce Burry. He and I were at a seminar, and I caught him in the hallway, and he's gone back to these streams several times since 1989, and during those site revisits, he does believe that the giant salamanders, the Dicamptodon, are recovering in those streams, but the tailed frogs are not recovering very well. So there's a long-term signature of those harvests. At that time, there were no buffers put out with the timber harvest. In the Olympic Peninsula, Pete Bisson and Marty Raphael did a study with their two research groups and looked at a whole bunch of stuff. And there's two papers in a GTR in 2002. They looked at fish and amphibians. The fish they found were influenced by in-stream habitat conditions, and the numbers of fish were highly variable across the study sites. So that's very consistent with this concept of a multi-state aquatic ecosystem. The numbers of animals really change depending on where you are. They did not find that the fish were influenced by buffers. So retrospectively, if there were buffers out there on the landscape or not, the fish did not seem to be influenced by that. But the amphibians were influenced by those watershed conditions, the riparian conditions, and the in-stream conditions. The amphibian numbers were also quite variable, not as ubiquitous as the fish. Amphibian abundance were highest in the oldest forest sites and lowest in the young sites with no buffers. And one species in particular, the Van Dyke salamander, was not found in any log site without a buffer, suggesting a vulnerability of that species to logging without buffers. A third study was a retrospective study by Margot Stoddard and John Hayes in Western Oregon, and they looked primarily at giant salamanders, torrent salamanders, and tailed frogs, which were positively associated with 46-meter buffers. And tailed frogs were associated with stands greater than 105 years old. So there is an emerging consensus that tailed frogs seem to carry quite a legacy of a past disturbance, and it takes a long time for them to recover. And here, with their association of stands greater than 100 years, it may take decades for them to recover from a disturbance. A fourth retrospective study by Pollitt et al. In the southern Washington Cascade Range. They looked at 4 stream categories: in clearcuts with no buffers, and clearcuts with buffers. Then they had a 35-year-old second growth stand and a 150-year-old old stand. And again, it was an amphibian study. They looked at tailed frogs and torrent salamander densities, and they found them to be much lower in managed forests than the old stands. And these two species were less abundant in the unbuffered clearcut than the buffered clearcut streams or the 35-year-old second growth. And there was an apparent negative effect on the torrent salamanders of stream temperatures greater than 14 degrees C. That was an association. So that's why I'm saying it was a negative effect. It was emerging from the study, but I think a follow-up would be needed to confirm that. However, giant salamanders were actually more abundant in the managed stands in the old forests and were greatest in number in the unbuffered and the 35-year-old stands. So, so not all species of amphibians are responding the same. And that is a bit of a consensus among studies. Different studies are finding different things over the course of time in the different contexts of their work. And I think you might recall I just said that the Corn and Burry work, Bruce Burry thinks that the giant salamanders are recovering in his old clearcuts. And here in this study, actually they were able to persist and actually have higher numbers in the clearcuts. So in science world, it's a little bit better to do an experimental study than a retrospective study. It gives you a little bit more inference, perhaps. And so it says 3. I actually have 4 experimental studies I'm going to talk about here. The first one is by Jeremy Groom, and he was looking at water temperature. So we're switching from an animal focus to a habitat attribute focus. And he compared the water temperature in reaches with a 6-meter no harvest within a 15-meter and 21-meter wide riparian management area. along small streams. So that's what's happening at that time along private lands in Oregon. Compared that to the state lands buffers, which was an 8-meter no harvest within a 52-meter riparian management area with limited harvest within the first 30 meters of streams. So let you look at that for a second. 8-meter no harvest, but there's a 30-meter limited harvest area. The result was that stream temperatures were elevated in the private land buffers and were not in the other. So they concluded that there was support that the state land buffers protected the stream from increasing temperature. A second study done in Roseburg, Oregon, was the Hinkle Creek Paired Watershed Study, and they looked at fish and amphibians. For fish, they didn't really detect any changes in their fish numbers or fish habitats. There were some subtle things happening. Cutthroat trout had increased biomass, increased weight post-treatment, and there was a trend that the animals were moving around a bit more. So this is a little bit inconclusive, and it was partly, I think, because of the study design that was difficult to detect a change in trout numbers. For amphibians, they focused on giant salamanders, and again, they found some variation in their occurrence over the site and through time, which is now becoming a theme of a multi-state condition of these aquatic systems. But they found no evidence of timber harvest effect within the first 2 years of harvest. One of their caveats was that there was a lot of slash in their streams, and it could have moderated the effect of harvest. So again, giant salamanders appear to be emerging as maybe resilient to harvest, but there might be some site-specific conditions going on in each study case. Another study, the Type N study in Western Washington, and many of you might be familiar with this, and I was fortunate to hear Mark Hayes speak on this just a couple weeks ago, and his abstract is where I got the bullets at the bottom, which will be published in Northwestern Naturalist the fall of this year. Within 2 years of harvest, giant salamander density decreased in the forest practices buffer relative to reference. So the forest practices buffer is here. It's this one. It has a 50-foot buffer along half of the perennial stream reach. So this is different than the other studies that we're seeing an effect on the giant salamanders. The tailed frog densities actually increased in the forest practices buffer and the no buffer treatments, so that's also different than what some other studies have shown. And no response of the torrent salamanders, and again the caveat is that there was slash, and there's some uncertainty about the confounding effect of slash in some of these clear-cut designs when there's not a buffer. So then I'm going to say a bit more about the study I've been involved with, and but I'm going to go through these quite fast because there's different components. But what I want to show you in the overall design of the study is that we had a 2-tree height buffer, a 1-tree height buffer, a variable width buffer, and a streamside retention. And in the matrix upslope of the buffers was a thinning, and we thinned twice, down to 80 trees per acre first, and then down to 35 trees per acre second. And this study is still going on. And we've looked at a lot of the different elements that I talked about previously in this diagram here. The only thing that we haven't looked at specifically is bank stability and fire. Lots of sites in Western Oregon. Here's a design where you see a 1-tree height buffer and a headwater, a variable width buffer, a streamside retention buffer, and then a unit of the reference condition that's not thinned. So these are young managed stands. lots of different products over time. I'm just going to focus on the last couple things that have come out. So at 10 years post-harvest and after the second thinning, our initial results for animals, it's the 50 meter, which is a 50-foot buffer, and the 70 meter, which is a 1 tree height buffer. We had increased numbers of duns and torrent salamanders after 2 thinnings. But the narrower buffers, the 6 meter buffer, which is 20 feet, we had decreased dun salamanders after the first thinning, and also decreased duns and torrent salamanders after the second. So that narrower buffer, we saw a cost for a couple of the amphibians. We tried to look at fish, but here's our fish tail. We have cutthroat trout and sculpin in our study, but we have such variable occupancy among reaches and sites that it's been a challenge for analysis, and we haven't seen any effects, but I think it's because of that variability in their occupancy at sites and among reaches. We just don't have enough reaches with fish to adequately look at the effect of buffers on cutthroat trout and sculpin in these headwaters. This is a complex slide. I'm just going to say we've sliced and diced the data many ways, and we do not see an effect when we put it all together like this on any of the habitat attributes, such as water depth, how much dry reach there is downwood, substrate condition, pools or riffles. However, we've done some more in-depth analyses, and some information is coming out on downwood and water temperature. So our wood is mostly late decay stage wood, so it's from that previous harvest of the initial stand. And we are getting some greater wood in the buffer, the 6 meter buffer. So we're only looking at wood in streams. So the stream wood in the 6 meter buffer, we're getting a little bit more there than in the others. And so that's either blowdown or damage from the harvest, but we're getting more wood in those narrowest 20-foot buffers. Our wood volume is increasing with basin area, so there does seem to be some process going on with the drainage, the watershed. So wood is not just coming from near the stream, but within the entire basin. Most of the wood, however, is coming from within 15 meters of the stream. That's 50 feet of the stream. 80% of the wood within 50 feet of the stream. Yet our late decay stage wood, we could only find the source stump of about half the wood. So about half the wood, we just didn't know where it came from. And we think that there's redistribution that happened during the first or second harvest. Things just moved around. You might be familiar with these FEMAT curves, which helped us design a 1 tree height buffer. Well, the initial wood curve is like that, but our data is showing that most of the wood is coming from 50 feet, so the shape of this curve would be drawn differently today. It would be a much steeper curve, I believe, if it were drawn from data like we have. Water temperature, one slide, so very quick. We've only been able to put data loggers out at one site, so we have a case study at one of our study sites, but we put scads of these data loggers out there, and so it's very well implemented. At this one site, we have no effect of the buffers on water temperature, yet there is quite a bit of spatial variability of water temperature. In 3 clusters, 3 types of streams, we seem to have stream head-like habitats that are very stable in water temperature, cold all the time. We have a dynamic cluster that varies a lot in water temperature, and that's associated with our lower slopes, wider streams, and west-facing aspects. And then we have this intermediate, a middle cluster, which are on higher slopes, narrower streams with south or south-facing aspects. So these geomorphic and topographic conditions seem to be most associated with our water temperature, which varies a lot, even in this very small area. Then we put the Norwest model out there to see how that predicted our water temperature, and it did great in capturing the mode, but we had a great deal of site variation in water temperature, and a lot of our areas were much colder than what the Norwest model predicted. So temperature, there's soil temperature, air temperature, and humidity. These are from the FEMAT curve, and we're getting information that these curves were probably drawn a little bit wrong for a stream. And I know I'm looking at the time. I'm going to go quickly through these next slides just to get through the to the end. And so there's a body of work coming out from Paul Anderson, who is also associated with the Riparian buffer study that we're both working at the same sites, although his study is different. He sees a sharp change in humidity and air temperature very close to the stream, and this was coined the stream effect by Jessica Reichen. And you've all felt it as you're near the stream, it's cool and moist, and then you have a different gradient as you go away from the stream. So that's in a reference condition, an intact stand. And Paul Anderson and colleagues have looked at the effects of, here's the stream effect, which suggests that, for example, this relative humidity curve would be much steeper initially and not drawn as a straight line. So they have looked at these buffers and the microclimates of the riparian zone. And here's some bottom line information from them. For air temperature along the stream, the only one that was significantly different was the stream side retention buffer. That was the only one that had an elevated air temperature. Of most concern is probably the water temperature, and I think the next one, this is relative humidity, sorry. Again, that stream side retention buffer, that was the 6 meter, the 20-foot buffer, had a lower humidity at the stream. Here's the soil temperature, or in the case of the stream, that's the water temperature. There was no difference between any of the treatments. Even the streamside retention buffer, the water temperature stayed the same. In the buffer zone, you see that there's no significant difference. There's one significant difference upslope, and this is a patch opening near outside of a one tree buffer. So that's in a tiny little clear cut where there was an elevated soil temperature. So his data were from the summer crunch time, the hottest time of the year, and they're not seeing that the stream temperature is changing with the upland thinning and the different riparian buffers that we've looked at. The stream effect is something to note, that temperature differential is quite different if you're up in a forest than if you're near a stream, and so the stream effect is radiating out from the stream. The stream effect goes about 10 to 15 meters from the stream. Other studies, a couple quick things here. Ruzicka finished his PhD a year ago, and he found that there's an edge effect going from the thinning into the riparian buffer zone 50 feet, and trees are responding to that with accelerated tree growth 50 feet from the edge of a riparian zone. So if one of your objectives is to accelerate old growth or tree growth in your riparian zone, that edge effect with a thinning outside is 50 feet. Well, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to probably skip some of the next few things. This was a composite slide of the effect of the various buffers on upland amphibians, so the ones that live outside the stream. The different studies are showing different results. This study showed an effect of at one site but not at another site. This study by Kluber saw no effect at 4 sites, 5 to 6 years after the thinning. Hawks and Gregory also saw that the riparian animals were intact after 10 years. There were some effects on upland invertebrates by Reichen et al. The context of that study was a riparian buffer with clear-cutting upslope. And I already said a little bit about Hawks and Gregory, and I think because I'm running out of time, I'm going to skip the slide, but you can come back and see some details of what they did. Earlier I mentioned shrinking heads with warm, dry years, and so with my colleague Julia Burton, I'll just give you a few more details of that, because not only did we look at retrospective conditions, we projected what this meant for the future with climate change. So we looked at since we've been doing this study for a long time, we have some data from warm years and wet years and dry years and cold years. And so retrospectively, we looked over a 15-year time span to see if we saw this concept of shrinking heads in the warm, dry years. And the answer is yes, we did. So the percent of the dry length of a stream reach was associated with the summer heat moisture index, also the basin area, and it was stream flow was not related to the buffer treatment. So yes, we have shrinking heads with climate, but the buffer doesn't seem to be involved. We projected that forward in time using different climate futures. That's what these bars indicate. And so that percent dry length increases over 2% in the various scenarios that we ran. And so we have increasing shrinking heads into the future with climate change scenarios. So torrent salamanders is one of those that seems to be really restricted to headwaters, and we have seen some effects of the buffers on them. So we looked at what this might mean, shrinking heads for torrent salamanders and headwaters into the future. And so we looked at those small basins, since small basins were associated with shrinking heads, and a watershed that had, you know, a lot of these headwater streams. We've seen this image before already. And what would happen if there was a 2% loss of that stream length? And just in this one basin alone, that sums to 9 kilometers of stream habitat. So what? Well, for these little salamanders, they're not very big. Their legs are only 1 centimeter long, if that. Their over-ridge dispersal just got longer. That's a lot of steps if you're a tiny little salamander. So there's a prediction of either genetic isolation or that there would be some adaptive response, and they would need to be getting across that landscape. So perhaps a little evolution to become more like an ensatina, drier and longer legs. Question for us, can we build climate-smart forests to foster that type of connectivity? And we've thought about that. How are these animals getting around? A study with Matt Kluber, we looked at where the animals were moving, and they move mostly right along the streams. Within 15 meters of the stream is where we saw most of the terrestrial salamander movement along streams. So they are moving, and they're moving along streams, and so we potentially can use these stream corridors as connectivity avenues. These are the I-5s for salamanders, and here's that first slide I show again, showing a potential I-5 along the diagonal of this BLM square. And you can make schematic diagrams of how to connect across landscapes, connect opposing drainages, maybe not an intact riparian buffer up and over ridgelines, but downwood is the ground habitat for these organisms, or maybe shaded areas, clusters of leaf trees. If you're in a BLM landscape, well, you should be looking at your diagonals. This is how to connect across BLM squares, or if you have a of land ownership. Look at those connections. How can you connect perhaps from the stream across to another adjoining land that you have your jurisdiction over for managing. At a landscape scale, think about connecting across discrete watersheds. Here is a model of one connection across discrete watersheds, one connection across among each watershed. You can see those little orange lines. One connection here, one here, one here, one here, one here. And it becomes a prickly pear as you aggregate those to a larger scale. That first model was linking 7th field watersheds. You could do that at a 6th field scale as well. You could target species locations such as tailed frogs or torrent salamanders, or your species of concern that you may have in your area. There is some evidence coming out from landscape genetics for torrent salamanders that they do follow the trees. That is submitted right now to the journal Molecular Ecology. You might also consider your disturbance regime, such as debris flow prone areas. Here are areas where 3 distinct watersheds come together. I just named these triads. These might be important places to consider dispersal across 3 big watersheds. Link the main watersheds. There's a lot of things you can think about for that landscape connectivity. So in sum, I've talked about each of these a little bit one way or another, and depending on where you are and who you are, your consideration may be refined, and not everything here is on your map, but these are the considerations that folks have been thinking about relative to headwater riparian buffers. Riparian buffers is your main tool for some of these habitat and animal distributions, but also thinning, aggregated retention, downwind recruitment. These are also in your toolbox. At landscape scale, think of where those uncut anchors are, the reserves, and how to manage for linkage areas. How wide should the buffers be? Well, depending on what study you have, there's a range between an 8-meter to a 46-meter buffer coming out from various studies from the Northwest. And it depends on where you are and what you're doing upland and what your consideration is. Is it water temperature alone? Is it other things like animals? And so here's just a very basic model. If your animals are the key thing, then you can provide the context and come out with an answer for a variety of different buffers. But the context is going to be very important. And it's not just animals that I suggest you put in this top box. It could be water temperature, downwood, other things. So the lessons learned, riparian buffers serve multiple objectives, and we've seen a lot of benefits of a 50-foot, a 15-meter buffer in our particular study. Other studies have come up with some different answers, however. Hedging uncertainties is probably a good thing across a broad landscape, but do consider that our system is, an aquatic system is multi-state. It's not one thing. It's several different states out there, and so targets for managing for a single condition is a bit unrealistic. So a variety of conditions, but consider the risks, the most important risks in an area. There's a GTR coming out by Gordy Reeves and his colleagues, and I was interested in that because he chose 3 considerations. You know, I showed you much more than 3, but for fish, he looked at intrinsic potential, thermal loading, and erosion landslide potential as the 3 considerations, and developed a model from that. And I'm not going to go into the details, but he has 4 management classifications shown here. And that translates into a 1 tree height buffer, a 100 50-foot buffer in important areas for fish or not important areas for fish in a fish-bearing stream, or if it's not fish-bearing, a 1 tree height buffer if it's ecologically important, and a much narrower buffer, 50 foot, that's our 15-meter buffer, if it's not ecologically important in a non-fish bearing. So I encourage you to look at that when it comes out. It should be out pretty soon. I saw the proofs just the other day. This is what his example looks like, where you have the buffer, but the blue part is the buffer, but then you have a lot of discretion of where you put your leaf trees from your upland ecological forestry condition, and a lot of those are put along the buffer. So we're still learning, and our results are a little bit variable across studies because of the design being different. But risks to some amphibians in particular are being documented, and these long-term studies are useful where we haven't seen effects initially. We are seeing some effects over time, and so that's an important consideration. Next generation field experiments are needed. We're lacking studies in fish-bearing streams and larger spatial scales. Most of the studies I've talked about today are at the reach level scale, and so at a larger spatial scale, a landscape scale, for example, or a watershed, these haven't been conducted yet. So that's it. Thanks to all my colleagues over the years, and also the people that have been funding my work, the BLM, Forest Service, and Oregon State University. And I've gone over time, so I'm sorry if I've lost folks as time have gone on. But I'm available for questions, and I'll hang in here until all the questions are answered. Thank you.
Well, thank you.